Thank you very much for having invited me here. I always love being in Brazil, and particularly in São Paulo, where I spent 7 beautiful weeks a few years ago teaching at USP. So I feel almost like being at home today, coming back here in this city. Thank you, Swedi, because it was Swedi's doing for this invitation, and I was really delighted to be invited back again and try to say a few things about, I guess this time, the future of the book. In trying to deal with questions of the future, I think, despite what our colleague said yesterday, that we should look to the future and not always to the past, I do think that looking back at the past can really be very, very helpful. In particular, in framing a vision, in organizing a viewpoint, in helping us raise questions, which then we can apply to the objects of the present, and thereby perhaps start looking into the future. To do so, I'm going to submit and to propose a mode of analysis which I find increasingly interesting, to in fact consider any kind of document, any kind of book, publication, or whatever. That analysis rests really on the distinction which sounds, and the two terms sound extremely similar, but they mean very different things. One is the so-called society of texts, or society of documents, and the other one would be the sociology of texts, or the sociology of documents. Now, the two terms come from two very well-known authors in very different fields. The Society of Text was picked up by a man named Edward Barrett back in the 90s, from, of course, the very famous book by Minsky, The Society of Mind. And he was trying to look at documents a bit in the way that Minsky was trying to identify the basic units of the brain that allow us to work towards a completely functional mental apparatus. The sociology of text, by contrast, comes from a bibliographer, actually, but a very special kind of bibliographer, the New Zealander called D.F. Mackenzie, in which he was trying to understand how texts should be organized in terms of the way in which they live, in which they're being produced, in which they are being received, in the way in which really they relate to the knowledge of people in a society. So on the one hand, you have this whole production of documents and the meaning it has for the knowledge of people. On the other hand, you would have the organization of the documents, the relationships between documents as they can emerge from their being in the world. Now let's start with the Society of Text, because it's one which is probably less understood and less discussed than the other one. In the case of the Society of Text, you may think that texts generally tend to relate to each other always in the same fashion. And that's where history becomes very interesting, because in a sense, you're going to see that they just do not do that at all. They relate to each other very differently according to the periods in which they emerge and live. If you look, for example, at the kinds of texts you find in the Sumerian period when writing was being invented, and in writing, by the way, was invented 3,000 years ago, but it is still being invented today. We are still within the whole process of inventing ever new forms of writing. But when that form of writing that emerged in the Sumerian and Akkadian empires in what is now more or less Iraq, the tablets, the clay tablets they used were really, you might say, externalized memories. Essentially, writing was there as a safety net. You went around the world and you could immediately recall things by just looking at your tablet or tablets. As I constantly recall to my students, if they were still using tablets in that fashion, they'd have to come to the university with at least a couple of trucks to carry their documentation, but obviously things have improved since then. But more importantly, these tablets, many of which are lists, simple lists, even things about astronomy are presented like lists of numbers and people looking at how these numbers fit together. It's really an externalized relationship, so that in effect each text is related to a task and probably to one individual. And you might say the society of text of the cuneiform tablets was at the beginning, I underscore the beginning, was really quite limited, probably almost nil. Now, when you move into the papyrus period, and I apologize for moving so fast through history, but I don't have a whole semester to speak this time. You find still the same kind of thing happening. You still find a process of production of documents which is difficult and slow, and the texts still play their memory system, but they start moving away from one particular individual. They begin texts of communities. They begin to be texts that will, for example, harbor customs, ways of resolving problems, ways of preserving the law to the extent that there is a law there. A person like Eric Havelock, the Toronto specialist of communications, has gone so far as saying that, in effect, the Iliad, the famous Iliad of Homer, was probably essentially an encyclopedia of know-how and things to do to make a society work in the early part of the Greek period of history in the 8th and 7th century before our era. So you have with this text the same basic function of externalized memory. You have communities attached to them instead of individuals, but these texts are not really relating to each other much yet, at least again at the beginning, although little by little systems of citations, systems of references to other texts will begin to appear. Satires will, of course, respond to text, and a society of text will begin to emerge. By the time of Aristotle and Plato, of course, then you have schools, you have a system of production of texts which fits itself within a tradition, responds to other traditions, and tries to locate itself as clearly and strongly as possible. There, you might say, a full society of text begins to develop. But it is still, in a sense, very much limited by the fact that all this is carried by scrolls. And when you take a scroll, you really are in a relationship to that scroll that maintains the primacy of the voice over the writing, and you still use that scroll to make, in effect, an effort of memory rather than an effort of criticism. The big shift, in my opinion, occurred in about the first, second centuries of our era with the book, the codex, essentially. When the codex appears, many things begin to happen, not the least of which is the possibility to start really looking at texts as things that you don't just consider as memory support, but also as objects that you can study and analyze in a rather free way. Why do I mean free? Because with the codex, you can start moving back and forth. You can start navigating within a text. And when the text is being put in front of you in a codex form, a lot of the structure, the form, the way the text is organized will lead you to wanting to look at other codices, other books, and you'll want to relate that. In a kind of emblematic fashion, I would suggest that we think about a very famous drawing that has appeared in the Italian Renaissance much later by Ramelli, where he develops the image of a scholar in front of a big wheel a huge wheel which is about 3 or 4 meters high, and on which there are platforms that remain horizontal however you turn the wheel. And in this fashion, you can put a book on each platform, and you can very quickly move from one book to the next. I would say that in a sense that Ramelli's wheel is beginning to instantiate, materialize the kind of desire, you might say, that's inscribed within the codex itself. You have within the codex the desire to move across the text and check and compare and contrast parts of the text with each other. And you have within the codex text the desire to move to other codices, other books, and start relating them to each other. There is another dimension that was developed in the codex that has to be also noted. In the 3rd century of our era, a great deal of work went on trying to essentially identify and stabilize what was fast becoming the Christian tradition. And all sorts of manuscripts had been floating about since the end of the 1st century, to the point that people were having trouble in various communities to decide which were the good texts, which text should be retained, which text should be thrown out. In effect, they wanted to firm up the whole doctrine of Christianity. To do so, not a father of the church, because he got in trouble with the future church, but one who could well have been, named Origen, began to do a study of the biblical manuscripts in order to understand how they work. And to do so, what he did is took a codex. On each facing page, he made 3 columns, and he's put across these columns the Hebrew Bible, the Greek Bible, the Hebrew Bible transliterated in Greek letters, and then 4 Greek translations of the Bible. Now, to do that, he needed over 40 books. I mean, this was a huge enterprise. He needed a whole technical support to do that. I won't go into this. But what's important is that suddenly he is in a position to look at text as objects that can be contrasted, criticized, collated, organized, and finally stabilized through this kind of process. The problem with this thing, of course, this process, is that when does it end? How do you end it? And the normal way to end it is by someone like Origen declaring, this is it. Now I've done good enough a job to essentially organize a believable, credible, convincing corpus of Christian texts, and we'll start from there. But in so doing, he immediately opened the door to a new position which said, no, this is not finished, we've got more work to do. And thereby began this long quest based on the book and the codex in particular in the Western tradition of trying to firm up and stabilize things on the one hand, and trying to, of course, criticize, transform, and go beyond what has been stabilized on the other hand. You have in that essence, in that tension, you have the essence of the scientific process. In science, you try to firm up and really create believable and stable statements about reality, and immediately you have people trying to shoot down what you've just established to go beyond, to create an even better representation of reality. The whole philosophy of Karl Popper is essentially based on this very simple remark, but it's also a very powerful remark, and we could find its origins in this early emergence of the Codex in the early part, in the early history of Christianity. Now, let me move now to the present, because you're going to say he's never going to speak about the future if he continues like this. The present, of course, has seen a society of text that has developed extremely richly by a system of citations, by a system of interrelations between books, bibliographies, and all kinds of ways to navigate through books. Libraries do that. Libraries create a society of texts. The classification and cataloging that a colleague here present and myself were joking about this morning is really part of this process of creating a society of texts. So let me stop there with the society of text at the present. Let me move back a little bit in the past again, sorry about that, to deal with now the sociology of text. Now, if you're producing clay tablets, if you have clay around you, no one is going to tell you that you cannot. All you have to know is how to put signs on that clay tablet and how to deal with it. So you have essentially, except for the skills of writing, which is a high learning curve, but admittedly, but you just have that obstacle, the rest is open to you. When you move to papyrus, or paper for that matter, you start having specialized technicians to produce those writing surfaces, and you have to deal with that and play with them. When papyrus became extremely difficult to use because it fell in the hands of Islam and the Arabic conquests, the Pope in Italy had a very tough time trying to figure out how to keep the documents of Rome, because the papyrus base was supposed to be the noble, the accepted form of document preservation. And he tried to have papyrus grown in Sicily without success. He used, of course, parchment as a substitute, but this was a substitute. And again, you need a lot of people to create the writing surface, be it papyrus, paper, or parchment. When you go to printing, which I haven't talked in the Society of Texts, but I could have invoked as well, printing again adds an extra layer in the multiplication of texts. You need again a number of people involved. So in effect, what you're saying is that the production of those documents we deal with is not just a free move. It's not a simple move. It's also something that's conditioned by the needs of the society, its desires, its economic system, and its power relationships. People will want some text to come out, others won't. Some people will have the money to do it, others won't. Some know the technology to do it, others don't, and so on. And so you have, in effect, in what is being organized as a production, circulation, storage, and reception system of text, you have, in effect, a kind of, I would say, reflection of the order of the society around those texts. And of course, what's fascinating is as societies change, texts which were, in a sense, disenfranchised or marginalized or even destroyed and forgotten, if one or two copies have survived, may suddenly revive and then become extremely, extremely important. Think of the De Rerum Natura by Lucretius, of which only one copy survived antiquity, which was in fact considered to be a completely unacceptable text by Christianity, and think of the role it played during the Enlightenment as one of the canonical texts of, let's say, the new thinking and the new way of addressing nature. So, society of texts are not always the same. Sociologies of texts are not always the same. The production of these texts and the way they relate to each other are the object of very complex histories that should never be forgotten. And they should not be forgotten when we come to the digital world. They shouldn't be forgotten to the digital world because this is precisely what is being changed right now. When you change the sociology of texts, you change who can produce texts. Now let's take just one simple example nowadays, the daily press. Until very recently, the daily press was a very well-controlled and organized system with newspapers and groups behind those newspapers that could be either political parties or financial groups, commercial groups, and so on. And there was an ethics among the profession of journalists, and there was an ethos, and there was a way of doing the news, and we were used to navigating through these newspapers, and we knew, in a sense, in each of our countries, which were the good newspapers, not so good, and the bad ones. We knew how to navigate that. Comes now this digitization business that we hear about with the internet, and what we find is that news are emerging from everywhere. Blogs, tweets, everything you want to talk about. The cost of producing these things is very low. The way to note these things is relatively simple, and people are beginning to learn how to navigate through that more and more efficiently. And as a result, you have, in effect, a new journalism that is emerging, that is creating all sorts of problems and all sorts of difficulties, which is also, in effect, contributing to the financial problems of the press and is creating all the anguish that you see when newspapers are closing down or trying to survive in one way or another. You also have the problems of governments who don't know how to control these new sources of news. Think of WikiLeaks and the recent debates about the release of the diplomatic sources that WikiLeaks began to do a few months ago. This is still a very hot topic and a very contentious one. This is part of the sociology of text. This is what's happening there. Society of text, I've talked about the citations. There is a beautiful book by Grafton about the emergence of the citation in the Western world. I recommend that book. But what's more important is that the established society of text that we had has been again totally transformed, or at least doubled up by a new system of society of texts, of course, which is this massive, gigantic, ever-changing, hypertextual structure of the web. So we now have this web structure, which is a publishing and expression tool available to all of us, exactly as Tim Berners-Lee had wanted to do it for the physicists. And as a result, we have now an entirely new society of text that we are navigating through by going from link to link, or alternatively, by relying on these extremely powerful so-called search engines that will aggregate for us and create their own society of texts for their own purposes. And I underscore that, because in creating a society of text, you create possibilities of meaning, but you also destroy possibilities of meaning. So you have all this new society of text that is emerging. There is a third dimension that is happening in all of this, which is the roles, the social roles that people occupied have all been submerged in effect and transformed. What is an author nowadays? We can all be, easily. We're back to the clay tablet. We can all write on the web. What is a reader? We all are. We all read. Are we readers and authors? I think we are becoming more and more negotiators through documents. We create documents to relate to people. We create communities around these documents. We are discovering actually what we always knew, but it was not so clear before, that documents cannot live without having communities around them, supporting them, preserving them, nourishing them, extending them, etc., etc. So you have now this new configuration, social configuration, where readers, authors, producers are all changing. Libraries are becoming publishers, for example. Publishers are becoming preservers sometimes because they have huge databases of documents which before were just printed and sent out to libraries. Now, companies like Springer or Elsevier are trying to preserve their own collections. You have really shifts in the roles. You have a fuzziness of boundaries in the roles, and you find people playing several roles simultaneously. And there is one last element which is becoming quite important. It is that I've been talking about sociology of texts and the society of texts, but digitization essentially starts treating everything as if it were a text. A picture, a video, sound. We now have 3D printer so that objects are becoming essentially transmissible and can be created very much like a text locally. What does that mean to the whole notion of text is that it is being now made a part of something that's much bigger and much, much greater, which, for lack of a better word, I'm going to call a document. So now we're moving from a society of text and sociology of text to a society of documents and a sociology of documents. And that also is important. If only you want to think about the importance of that, remember what happened when print came along. It separated for a long time, rather radically, the text from the images. And that did a lot of things to our psyche and our civilization, because we treated texts as if it could live all by itself. Now with these documents, and including everything at once, this kind of divorce between text, image, sound, and the rest of it is becoming ever more difficult. And there is yet another dimension that one has to take into account. It's the fact that instead of having a well-punctuated system of production, distribution, etc., things become ever more interactive, to the point that even reading is no longer a kind of separate phase in the whole society and sociology of documents. Reading becomes a kind of interactive intervention in all these processes. Reading, for example, is going to probably, to take a very simple and limited example, is probably going to be translated into the kind of interaction people have with the video games, which appear to me to be the harbingers, the pioneers of new forms of literature, of new forms of storytelling, of new forms of writing. So where does that leave us for knowledge and the future of the book? Well, the first thing is that we should get away from the notion that books are simply going to stay there except transformed into Kindles, and we'll just have a page at a time on a little electronic tablet. That's just, the Kindle is to the book what PDF is to print. It's just trying to extend the PDF or the book into the electronic form. It's nothing really new. But when an instrument is going to emerge that's going to allow us, and I think the iPad is moving in that direction, something where you can manipulate documents, where you can relate documents to each other, when you can relate to documents as an individual, where you can really work with all these documents instantly across time, space, and varieties of documents, you're going to have something very different from what the book is still nowadays. We're used to, and that's the legacy really of Sumer, we're still in Sumer when we have a fixed material book which has a little volume and you carry in your pocket and all that. The clay tablet and the book from that perspective behave exactly in the same way. When you put that book in electronic format, it doesn't want to stay alone. It wants to create a kind of universal or a Malleus wheel. It wants to be all over the place and it wants to relate to everything. The desire for the society of text becomes extreme. Now that raises a number of very important issues. What's going to happen to an author? What's an author in this world? What happens to intellectual property in this world? And I'm sure my colleague will say a lot more about that than I do. But it's obvious that if you want a completely open and rich environment for this kind of interactive, ever-extending society of text and sociology of text, you cannot have all sorts of barriers put back in the system. Think of science. The whole open access movement has been built precisely on the idea of liberating this great conversation that science really is in order to make it work better and go faster and further and so on, and be cleaner too. So what we have to think in terms of the future of the book is not in terms of just a technical translation of our little codex into something that will be the equivalent of the codex. We have to think about a way in which we have to manage a society of text and a sociology of text extremely differently. And this leads to my conclusion finally. I'm going to return to a point I made a little bit earlier. Any document, any text doesn't live if it is not actively surrounded by communities. I think the future of the book will translate into the creation of communities around certain kinds of topics. The documentation will just extend indefinitely with some probable relative boundaries, classifications, organizations of that particular area covered by that community. But really what will be the future of the book will be a community. Those communities will bring people in a very, I assume generally, loose fashion. They will have a very variable geometry, you might say. But and every one of us will belong to several communities. Obviously, we have various interests and various skills. But the unit, I think, of the future will be the community, not the book. Which, for example, and this will be my last word, the librarians, to take them, and I think quite a few of you are in that business here, librarians have been used to dealing with books, to working with books, to organizing books. I think in the future you're going to organize communities. In the universities, for example, I think libraries are going to be the kind of engine that will work against the silos and the disciplinary exclusives that exist in departments and the rest of these kinds of structures in order to make the knowledge flow across these structures and make the university work more like a web of communities, a network of communities that will constantly throb together, if I may use that kind of image. We'll have a throbbing university of communities. I'm sure that will bring all sorts of images to your minds, but please calm yourself. I think that the work, therefore, of a librarian will be that kind of work on people rather than on books, and it shows what the future of the book will be. It will be a much tighter, a much more intimate, a much more powerful relationship between knowledge and aesthetics and art and anything you can do with documents and groups of people. It's a thing that we've been seeing coming for the last 5,000 years. We don't have to be blind to that trend. It's overwhelming, and the coming of the digital age is not changing anything to that trend. It's just making it go suddenly a lot faster, farther, and relating things across time better. And that's what I think is the future of the book and the future of knowledge. Thank you very much.